but you come from a real enriched environment, and so that, is a sort of a protective factor. Or the opposite, you come from an impoverished environment, as it were, and that is an additional risk factor. And so that interaction between the genes and environment is real important. And so that's number 3, that interaction. And then I like this statement: there's multiple genetic and environmental risk factors are involved. Okay, there's a bunch of different genes. There's a bunch of different environmental risk factors. The amount of education your parents have, the amount of language that's in the home, and on and on, right? Your experiences in the world. Okay. I believe that, because dyslexia, because specific language impairment, because ADHD, right? Because all these different disabilities are highly heritable. The family history is where you should always start. And I don't know if Ricky could answer that. I don't know if APS has sort of a standard family history thing, or, but I really encourage you guys to pursue the family history in a more robust way. Okay? So this is straight out from Mather. She says scientists have known for years that genes have a substantial influence on the development of both reading and spelling skills, and that dyslexia runs in families. Okay? That's because it's genetically based. And then I really like Nancy Mather for her plain language. Like, she says what lots of diagnosticians are thinking, but it hasn't been sort of lifted to the level of open conversation, and it hasn't sort of been standardized in the field. People are born with dyslexia, okay? That's a pretty clear statement. That, to me, I think that the families don't understand that, the teachers don't understand that, but basically nobody in the field really out there in the schools really seems to understand that. You're born with dyslexia if you have that susceptibility, if you have the genetic thing, okay? It's not acquired. It's not from bad parenting. It's not from bad teaching, okay? Many times I've been an IEP and I say that to the family. It's not from bad parenting. And then the tears come down because they've been sitting there the whole time blaming themselves. If only I'd read to little Johnny more. No, that's not, you didn't cause the dyslexia, okay? So I think that's an important statement to make to the families also, okay? So they can move on with the intervention. Okay? I titled this Crypto Dyslexia, right? And again, this is Nancy Mather's clear language, okay? I threw in some unclear language. Sometimes a parent does not recognize that she has dyslexia until one of her children has been diagnosed. I would say that's more the rule than the exception, okay? I can't remember, who, one of you guys came up to me and said, I'm the lead teacher at the school and I've been going through 200 IEPs and none of them said they had dyslexia, okay? Even today, 2015, they're still not identifying the dyslexic kids, okay? And so, right, and you can imagine 25 years ago when the families when they were little, they definitely weren't identifying it then, because back then they had a reason, because the science was still real limited and piecemeal. Now the science is real strong to support it, and so I think that's pretty common, and that's where you have to have on your family history. You have to do if you say, is there a family history of dyslexia? They go, nope. Well, that's not good enough, really, right? Because really, so you needed to have probing questions about, well, has there anybody had the difficulty with reading or spelling, right? You kind of probe and talk about, well, what about the cousins, and what about the aunts and uncles, and what about grandma and grandpa? And we go across multiple generations and broaden that question out. The family history is not limited to this family right here. It's the whole genetic family, right? That's what I think you need to look across each genetic layer in the family like that, each generation. And almost always, if you do that, then they'll go, well, yeah, his cousin's got ADHD, and his uncle's got a language impairment, and it appears. And the reason I think that's important is because an awful lot of the time, and that's where when Ricky and I first started talking about this class, it's great when you get a kid who's really, they have clear disability, or you get a kid who's got they don't have a disability. But unfortunately, most of them fall right on the fence. and you're looking at all these scores going, well, what is it? Is it a disability or is it not a disability? And that, to me, the diagnostic question is the family history. If there's a strong family history, then that pretty much answers it, right, when the kid lands on the fence, all right? All right, so in addition, parents may not know whether or not relatives have dyslexia, right? And that's very common. And that's where you have more than a one-line question with them on a questionnaire, okay? So I say it's the diagnostic question. And this is from Nancy Mather. She says, thus, a formal educational evaluation for dyslexia should begin with exploration of a family history of reading difficulty. I have not seen that anywhere else in any other book, okay? I don't, if you, and maybe I'm just latching on to that because that's how I feel, but I have felt that way.
They talk about it at IDA all the time, but I don't know that I've ever read it.
Yeah, and I think the district, for you guys, where you're gonna end up in your jobs, I think that this needs to be enshrined more as standard practice, okay? It should begin with the exploration of family history. That's the diagnostic question, in my opinion, okay? Where I first saw that was from Sally Shaywitz, the lady that overcoming dyslexia, the lady at Yale, who's a real big, established leader in the dyslexia field. She said that, maybe I was watching a video somewhere, I've never been able to actually find it in the book where she said that. It's the diagnostic question, and I thought, I agree. So the other thing is, though, there's the genes, okay, that are transmitted through the family, and one kid or in one family member, that gene package is expressed as dyslexia, but for another it's expressed as a language impairment, and for another it's expressed as ADHD, for another it's all of the above, okay? It's the same groups of genes or overlapping groups of genes, and so that family history question is not just, does anybody in the family have dyslexia? I say is there a history of reading and spelling problems? Is there a language impairment history? Or is there ADHD or attentional? And again, how many of these family members have ADHD but have never been diagnosed, right? A lot, tons of them. And so that's where it's more of a conversation, I think, than just a one-line on question. Because often it'll come back as no if it's like that, okay? So, this was my part. I would add that in there on the family history. Add in that explain about how ADHD and language impairment are it's about 40–50% overlap. Okay? So dyslexia is strongly genetic. Okay, people are born with dyslexia. It's not acquired. Between 30 and 50% of children with a parent who has dyslexia will develop the disorder. And they always report it in this way, and I wish they would report it the other way. If you're a student with dyslexia, what's the chances of your parent, go the other direction, not from the parent down, but from the student up? Because it's a lot higher. Or, the family, in my opinion, if you're sitting there with dyslexia, the chances that you have a family member with dyslexia is basically 100%. Okay, it's been my experience that it's almost always that it comes out like that. And so I think this is, in my opinion, sort of is a little misleading. Yeah, not every child in a family has dyslexia, but every child who has dyslexia has a family member who does. Okay, so if you go the other way, okay, and so that's what I put down. 100% of students have dyslexia have a family member who's dyslexic. Okay, because it comes down to the genes. Which genes are contributing? Okay, there's a lot of research. I went over a couple years ago, I don't know, maybe it's been 5 years now, to the medical school. They have these things called grand rounds where they bring in professors from other colleges, and they brought in some of the guys from Denver who were doing the twin studies and the genetic research. And so there's that kind of stuff. I was going to say, just so keep your ears open for that, because there's a lot of sort of regional stuff. And that Denver is a real hub for the genetic studies and the twin studies on dyslexia and ADHD. University of Denver, University of Colorado at Boulder are two real big centers for that. And so those people, I think there's some interchange there. Because dyslexia is familial and heritable, researchers had initially hoped that dyslexia would be explained by just one or only a few genes. And so, as I've followed it, starting in the early 2000s, there was there's sort of been this ever-growing list of genes, but still not that many that what I see in the list, I'm still only seeing 4 or 5, we'll see some of them DC2 and Robo1 and and KY, whatever the number is on that. And so there is a group of them now that they've identified. Multiple genes of small effects as well as environmental factors contribute to the development of dyslexia. And I think this fits real well with my conceptualization of a learning disability. A lot of the time the kids, like Ricky was saying, the kids who land on the fence, they don't have any one, grand slam processing deficit. What they have is 5 little grounders, right? Where there's a constellation of smaller deficits that when you aggregate them, it does end up significantly affecting their, right? And that's what you're gonna have to deal with, is that sort of that ambiguity. Is some of the kids, yeah, they've got their C-top score is 71, there's no question. But a lot of the time it's gonna be a lot more gray than that. And so, so I think this statement sort of captures that. There's multiple genes and they're having these small effects, but when you combine them, along with the environmental factors. Okay, so here's DC-DC2. DC-DC2, remember in the book, she had the little diagram of the chromosome, right? The little X-shaped thing, and the top ones are the P's, and I can't even remember what the Q's. And so DC-DC2 is a 6P, it's somewhere on the P arm, so they located it, okay? This, I found it very interesting. This gene encodes double cortin domain containing, I guess that's the DC-DC family member, okay, for the name. This family member is thought to function in neuronal migration where it may affect the signaling of primary cilia. Apparently the neurons have little cilia on there. That's how they move. They migrate. That's the mechanism by which they migrate. There's the neural tube, I think it's called, where they form. Okay, it's 16 weeks gestation. And then they have to migrate along that neural tube to their proper destination, okay? And then the brain forms and they're in the right place, okay? But if those cilia aren't working properly, then who knows where that neuron's gonna migrate to. It's a neural migration disorder. At first, when I saw DC-DC2, I'm like, all right, they've got a gene, okay, and that made me happy. Here's a gene, it's not speculative anymore. They've identified these, associated this with dyslexia. Well then, when I read about DC-DC2 and what it does, its job is to code for normal migration, right? It makes perfect sense. For me, I'll show you in further how that makes sense. So, mutations in this gene have been associated with reading disability, okay? Type 2, and I'm not sure what they mean by that, also, I guess, developmental dyslexia, okay? And so, a lot of this, again, I think came out of Colorado. So, I apologize if I put this in before. So, Albert Galaberta, this guy, he's a neuro and anatomical scientist at Harvard, okay? And he worked with some of the original guys, Norman Geschwind, and these guys who were the real founders, sort of, like the original scientists studying dyslexia. And he got brains donated somehow. What I read was they were from, and I thought this was interesting, here's how my mind works, that they were motorcycle accident victims, okay? And I thought, ADHD and motorcycles, and now I'm dead. There were just some connections in my mind, So he did these post-mortem studies on these brains, and he found these areas they call them ectopias, which are where the neurons have migrated to the wrong place. Okay, they were looking for big defects, any kind of defects in these brains, and it turns out it was these little micro defects was the only thing they found. Otherwise, it's right. We know that because dyslexia it's not a global problem. It's a real specific problem in reading and spelling. And so he found these ectopias, right? And these are in the language areas. Boy, that makes sense. That fits the phonological. Phonology is one end of your language, right? Skill. Okay. Additional defects in the thalamus and the cerebellum. The thalamus is where your sensory information is processed, and that's the one thing seems like she had an error in the book about that, and well, I think I got another slide on that. Then the cerebellum is, I think, I think of it as motor skills, and I see that, and maybe you guys too, where it's not uncommon for the dyslexic kids to kind of be sort of clumsy and have sort of motor, not gross, disability level motor problems, but some mild motor problems. And so that it all fits together real nicely. I like it when the research sort of matches what I see on the ground in the schoolhouse, because it's not always like that. Sometimes they're saying one thing, like when they're saying there's no visual part to dyslexia. It's not visual. I'm sitting there with the kid going, but this kid clearly has a visual problem, right? In this case, though, the things agree real well, the science and the on the ground stuff. So they did this animal modeling, okay, where they had these mutant rats, where they caused the rats to have ectopia through the genetic mutations, okay? And guess what? It results in auditory processing defects, okay? Well, just like, with the dyslexic kids with the phonology. You remember Nina Kraft, that hyperactive lady in her video where she had the auditory brainstem stuff, okay? And so, again, so there's the anatomical stuff that supports it. There's what that gene codes for, DC2 codes for neural migration, that supports it. The animal model support, it's a very well supported and understood disorder in my opinion. Okay, so the thalamus, she said in there that it was for tactile, right? In chapter 5, or I guess it was chapter 4, she said the thalamus processes tactile information, and it does, but it processes also auditory and visual, all your sensory input, as I understand it. I looked it up on Wikipedia because I thought, well, maybe I figure I must be wrong, right? I looked it up on Wikipedia, and they said that all the sensory stuff is routed through thalamus. And so you think if you've got some neural migration problems in your thalamus, that you see how it could. Well, I always say dyslexia exists along multiple dimensions. Well, there's visual information coming through your thalamus, there's auditory information, right? There's all kinds of sensory stuff that's like the circuit board that it has to pass through. And so that, again, fits real well with what I see. Some of the kids have more visual, some are more auditory, and you can see how with a neural migration problem, depending on where the ectopias ended up, it would affect one side more than the other, okay? Differences, this is from Galaberta. They found in this medial geniculate body, that's part of the thalamus, where it processes auditory input and is connected to the primary auditory cortex. That's that stuff Nina Kraus was she had those recordings and those measurements on. The thalamus is believed to both process sensory information, and this is not from the book, this is separate, this is from Albert Galaberta. It's to process the sensory information as well as relay it. So it comes in, it processes it, it sends it up to the cortex, but then there's this back and forth thing that goes on too, right? Where it's not just a one-way, it's not just a one-way process, it's a reciprocal process, okay? So each of the primary sensory relay areas receives strong back projections, okay? So it sends it up, but then there's also this communication back and forth between. Obviously, that's not a conscious thing, right? You're not sitting there, telling your brain to send these signals. And that's where I talked about that. I believe that there's a lot going on below this, all this subconscious processing, and we're not measuring that stuff, okay? But I think that's really, there's a lot going on there. What my hope for you guys is that when you walk out of here, you feel like you have at least a good foundational understanding of dyslexia, because on your first day in your job, you're going to be asked, does Johnny have dyslexia? And I want you to have a good foundation on which to make that decision, okay, and an understanding of dyslexia, right? All right, so here's this is all from Galaberta's, and there's and I promise I'm going to get it up. I'm going to make that file that has all the extra readings. This is from 2006. They had an article in the journal Nature on this. So he talked about DC2, 16 to 24 weeks of gestation, and this is actually pictures of the ectopia. This is the one in the human brain here. You can see. I assume this is your cortex here, okay? Because the cortex is the thin gray matter part, okay? And so there's the ectopia, or there's a picture of one right there. This is one in which my wife, for a while, was gonna do a PhD at the medical school on like neuroscience, right? Which is great, she's super smart, no problem. But then, you know, what you gotta do is cut rats' heads off all day and do horrible things. And so, you know, I'm glad personally that she quit, that you know, because what this is, they took a thing, they stabbed a rat in the brain and gave it an ectopia. And oh my God, that's just not right, in my opinion, you know. And then I think these are the mutant rats down here where they do it genetically, where they engineer it so that it has a ectopia. So I think that's interesting. There again, you know, there it is. That's from one of the dyslexic brains. And then there's that picture again. Okay, so this is from this. I like what Galaberta said, and I apologize this wasn't in the reading, but I think it supports it real well. It said some of the behaviors correlate with changes in the thalamus. So the behavior he's talking about phonological stuff or the visual stuff. Okay. Whereas others are more likely the result of changes in the cortical circuits. That's the white matter connection between those different, from the thalamus up to these different areas in your brain, you know, and in the left hemisphere of your brain, okay? I agree with that, okay? Although both phonological and auditory processing deficits could be demonstrated in many dyslexics, and here's where the gray area comes in others, the latter deficit, so that's the auditory processing, may improve with age and thus be undetectable at the time of a dyslexia diagnosis. When I read that, that's exactly what you'll see. There's going to be kids that by the time you test them, they're in 5th grade or even, you know, it depends on the kid, their sort of phonological auditory stuff is sort of normalized, but they're still dyslexic and they still have word reading and spelling problems, okay? But that phonological processing score is coming in.
Just this week.
Yeah, and
A
so
5th grader was that way. I've seen it so often where they can get decent phonological scores and you look at their spelling and their reading and it's like.
yeah, right. And so when we got our training, and basically my thinking is, you know, hardly any programs out there are not, the people aren't walking out with this information in their head, okay? And so I want you to have this, because you're going to be in that situation where, so what are you going to say? Johnny's not dyslexic because his phonology, he got a 91 on his phonology, right? And, you know, and that's a very consequential statement you're going to make because there's, you know, whatever the accommodations, even if it's, I don't know what it's going to be on the GRE, right? You know, if you're dyslexic, then you have a disability and you're entitled to accommodations and interventions. And so when you say no, because his phonology's okay, he doesn't, I got a report from APS from Corrales Elementary 2 weeks ago. It said right across the bottom of it, if you do not have a phonological impairment, you are not dyslexic. Well, Albert Galaberta from Harvard would disagree.
So are those kids being labeled as SLP then, because you're not seeing the phonologist?
No, they're not. I would say generally it would be,
They're
you
not
know,
getting
well,
identified
they,
at all,
you know,
or what's happening?
well, there's 2 different criteria that districts have. You know, one, you gotta meet one standard for dyslexia and another standard for SLD. And so, and the dyslexia standard is not very unified, or you know, each district kind of has their own take on it. And so, you know, well, as we're saying, you're going to make the decision, but what you want to be able to do is to support your decision, right? If you make it, then you need to be able to back it up with the information.
And this kid, actually one of my interns tested on Saturday, sort of, we're gonna go back and do some more stuff. It looks to me like we're gonna say he has dyslexia, but he's not gonna meet the criteria, he's having LP. And he's a 5th grader, very bright, he's been in SAT all the way, and he keeps making progress. He's one of those really bright kids, so I want to document that he has dyslexia, but I would hate to see this kid go into a language arts middle school special ed. You know, he's gonna have to work his ass off to do it in a regular ed, but I think it would be a disservice for this particular kid. Even if he met the criteria, I would probably go to the meeting and make an argument that maybe we want to see how he does in regular ed before we consider him for the middle school.
keeping that documented will also help in the future to get extended time for ACTs, SATs, if nothing else.
And what I do in those situations, because this isn't the first one, is if they don't meet, we say they don't meet criteria for special ed, I said, you go and get a 504 and you start documenting right now that you need extra time. And you keep that going all the way through high school. When you get to the ACT, the SAT, you say, we've been doing this from day one, or, whenever it was.
Question, so I know we talked about different interventions for students of different ages with dyslexia. Do you see more of that correlation between phonological impairments and dyslexia in the earlier years, like in
Well,
kindergarten?
I mean, absolutely, yeah, and you absolutely, we see a lot more of it there. It's expressed more, but I think there's more and more research that's showing though that even older kids continue to benefit if they're coming in with low phonology scores, that they would continue to benefit, even though it's something that's normally in kinder and first grade. If you're in 5th grade or middle school and you still have a phonological processing deficit, then I recommend that they do interventions at that level also. But yeah, definitely more, you see it more commonly than over. I think my sense from reading, and I'll put it up, there's a great lecture this Albert Galaberta did where I first heard about him. The International Dyslexia Association, every year they have this thing called the Norman Geschwind Lecture, and it's some prize, and he made Albert Galaberta did one of these lectures, and he talks about that, with maturation, that for, in the animal models, that they're not doing an auditory intervention with a rat, right? But that the auditory processing deficits resolve just with maturation, and I guess, the experience, right? It just in the hearing environment, so, yeah.
I have a question that I don't know you can answer, but I was thinking this is a good, maybe they could. Really, how many classrooms for dyslexics are there in APS? Like, say we diagnose somebody, okay, you have dyslexia. Where are there any? Do you know any in your schools?
Well, our special ed people got trained in Wilson
Yeah.
and in Spire, and I don't know so much about Spire, but Wilson is an Orton Gillingham based, definitely for kids with dyslexia.
I worked in one school that had a Wilson program.
There for a while, everybody was getting trained, and then they switched over to Spire, which I believe is also
I think
I mean, I was
Yeah.
wondering.
All of the high schools are.
Yeah, I'm middle and high school, so
I think the great majority of them inside of Steiner.
they do.
I mean, we were actually forced to start to.
And that's where I brought up that other week, where this is where you get in trouble for those kids who have, which they don't come along very often, but they have a comprehension problem that they can read everything. And they want to cram them into a Wilson or a Spire program, and I'm in the meeting saying, that is not what this, he doesn't need it.
So does like virtually every elementary school have a Spire or something? Or is she supposed to Spire? They're supposed to?
Yeah, in theory, who
That was
knows?
like, I mean, it was a legitimate question, I don't know.
Do you know how many special ed positions are open right now?
Oh, that's
Yes.
right.
So I would bet there's a plenty that don't. Sorry.
Yeah,
Or they're being taught by teachers that aren't.
yeah.
Right.
Okay,
Oh,
so,
no, wait, I just want to add, because we don't talk about the others, like Los Lunas and Berlin and up north. Do you guys have reading programs?
That is what I was supposed to ask. What is the Wilson and what is the other one? Is that a reading program for
yeah,
kids with dyslexia?
intervention.
There's a whole bunch of them. There's a lot of them out there now.
They're Orton Gillingham based, which the Orton Gillingham stuff is the one that's multisensory. So they're doing multisensory stuff to help the kids learn, different tactile and different modalities. And then they're really focused on the structure of the spoken and written language. And that's really how I would define Orton Gillingham, is that it's a multisensory approach to teaching the structure of the language. And so then Wilson is, they're like a derivative. They're very similar to that, because they're all focused on the same language. It's the same structure, right? And I don't know, Wilson, is Wilson multi-sensory to you guys?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then the Spire, I don't know, yeah, I don't know if it is or not, so.
We have people that probably.
They're intervention curricula that are designed, you know, for reading disabled kids.
Like, just an example, because there are some people that, yeah, Alicia's explaining it. You want to go ahead and talk about, no, because Chris is probably not the only one that doesn't know what we're talking about when we say multisensory.
So I'm trained in Wilson, but the multi-sensory is there's like color coded things, there's tactile things that they move, they teach them to tap their fingers, sometimes there's gross motor
Okay,
stuff.
the tapping, is it for sounds and syllables
For
and all those?
segmenting the sounds and making them together. So
And-
that's multi-sensory in a nutshell.
And I want to come back down to Berlin. Do you guys have programs that are?
We do not have any set program. A lot of teachers could sign up. Last year was the first year they offered the Orton Gillingham training. And I believe there was about 60 of our teachers was all they had to max it out as far as money-wise. But I don't know how many of those teachers are actually using what they learned in their classrooms yet. I think most of them.
A lot of it was finances, because they said, okay, we're gonna pay for you guys to go to this thing, well, and they actually had it in Belen, but then, and they gave us the books, and then all the online stuff that would help us out, they said, no, sorry. So we had to buy our own.
I just wanted to mention that too, in APS, when I started teaching, everyone knew Wilson, but it's like 60 hours of training, and then they switched over to Spire,
Yeah.
which is about 15 hours of
That's
training.
why they switched.
And because it's cheaper, but I think Spire stinks. I don't think it teaches phonics.
We use
Yeah.
Orton Gillingham and Wilsonist, and we actually had the highest growth in the nation last school year.
Wow. And that's with your special ed teachers, right?
Only tier 3.
Yes, yeah.
Are you
Sean,
guys
do you
still-
know in Gallup that they have?
Gallup doesn't recognize dyslexia.
Nobody.
Nobody's acknowledges dyslexia, it's just specific learning disability.
Yeah.
So we do have one good reading program that a lot of people can train on called Read Naturally, or no, Project Read. Read Naturally is another one. But Project Read, and it's a good tier 2, sometimes tier 3 thing in Gallup. And it
Well,
does a lot of this stuff.
We need to send the special ed police out to.
Yeah.
Well, not special ed, I don't know what it is. It's that bill that got passed in San Jose that has no money attached, so
Right.
what?
But the thing about what's happening now in APS with the Spire program is that, at first the district paid for all of the materials for the schools, and now they've said, okay, now we're not gonna do it anymore, now you have to do it. And so all the schools are now pulling back and saying, well, we don't have the money for, because it's really, it's more expensive. So the schools are all pulling back now and saying, well, we can't afford, those materials, so we're not gonna have classes anymore. So.
All right, so I'm gonna keep going. So this is still from Galiberti, he says, and still others, auditory processing deficit would remain in the face of improved phonological problems, leading to a diagnosis other than dyslexia. I guess that would be like a central auditory processing disorder. In the present, I like this last sentence, in the present state of knowledge, so this is 2006, so that's pretty current, it hasn't really moved on that far since then in my awareness. It would be most prudent to state that the variety of behavioral deficits in dyslexia, okay, so that's the visual, the auditory, the attentional, right, the processing speed, the stuff that chapter 5 talked about, the variety of behavioral deficits in dyslexia have a common underlying genetic and brain developmental cause. That's a clear statement to me. I really like that. I thought that was a good addition to this chapter. Okay. All right. So here's I think, and maybe it was in this week or last week, the Marianne Wolf, the double deficit that was on the midterm, right? What's the double deficit? So there's the naming speed kids, there's the phonology kids, or the kids with both, the naming speed and phonology. So this is my question, is this the double deficit? Parents with dyslexia who have children with dyslexia tend to be more severely impaired on word reading and rapid naming. To me, right, that's the double deficit, okay? Then parents with dyslexia who have children without dyslexia. And so what that said to me, that double deficit, if you're the double deficit kid or family, that gene is really powerful, right? Because the genetic studies are showing that. Those people, the parents with the double deficit, are more likely to have kids with dyslexia than a parent without the double deficit. Okay, even if they have dyslexia, but not all, the naming speed and the phonology. Okay, so that to me is sort of the real world expression of the double deficit theory. Okay, so I read some. I think Seidenberg has this term dystechia, which I love that term. You know, which is dystechia is not a genetic based thing. It's from your teacher was never properly trained, and they don't have a proper curriculum in which to teach you with, okay, and therefore you end up with dystechia instead of dyslexia, okay. The genetic influences of dyslexia appear to be most pronounced in cases that involve relatively severe phonological impairments that are out of line with the person's other cognitive abilities, okay. So that's not dystechia, right? The genetic influences are more pronounced in the severe kids. That makes sense, doesn't it? If you're more severely dyslexic, then I would expect the genes to be more apparent, okay? And to me, that ties those together, okay? So I say that's not dystechia, that's, okay, the opposite. So Ricky has said many times, and this is where, you know, you're gonna get out there and land in the real world too and see how it is, you know, when you got so many kids to do and so many reports to do and you're trying to streamline it. And what I started doing was I just, you know, because I had a verbal working memory score from the WISC, from rapid, you know, from digit span and letter number sequencing, you know, it's a phonological memory score. I stopped doing that composite on the CTOP, okay? But by doing that, I stopped doing non-word repetition, okay? And
Which I love.
Ricky kept telling me, non-word repetition is the one that correlates. Non-word repetition is the one that correlates. Well, sure enough. So overall findings suggest that the heritability of dyslexia is higher in individuals who have a poor ability to repeat nonsense words, okay? You know, so here's how I'm thinking about this sentence, is that there's kids that have the gene, okay, that they're predisposed to dyslexia, and maybe they're dyslexic, okay? And then there's the environmental factors, okay? And then there's that interaction, okay? And so, I'm sorry, I lost my thought. Oh, the heritability part, right? And so, it's, if you have this, if you're poor on the nonsense words, okay, that's, I think it's important to test that. Even though you've already got a different, on the WISC, if you do the WISC, you'll have a phonological memory score, but it's not measuring that specific thing, that non-word repetition, okay? And I think that it's important to make sure you put that in. After reading this chapter and talking to Ricky, I believe that more and more, that it's really important to measure that, okay? This is from I tried to find a graphic here. In that chapter, they talk about, well, what is heritability, right? Remember they talked about that, you know, that these traits are heritable, you know, through the genes, okay? And so the guy, I thought it was a really funny paragraph where she said, somebody, Wang was the guy's name, she said, Wang gives a very clear explanation, okay? And that is what she said. But then this was the clearer explanation. It should be understood that heritability is an abstract mathematical parameter that is not known to have tangible reality. What? And so I wanted to have a tangible reality graphic, but this was and when I went searching, this is what I came up with, and so I like that one. I like that. All right. So heritability merely describes, this is from the book, the proportion of the statistical variance in a trait that was attributable to genetics in a particular study. And you can see it's real qualified there, you know, the statistical variance, so it has to rise to the level of statistical significance. That's the problem with a lot of these studies, is that the sample size isn't big enough. If there's subtypes of dyslexia, then the certain groups, there's not enough of them in that sample to rise to statistical significance. So they go, no. And so the devil's in the details on all this stuff. So here's the Colorado, they had that long name, the Colorado Longitudinal Twin Study, whatever the full name was it for. They followed 10-year-old twins for 5 to 6 years. I like the longitudinal nature of this also, that like, you know, I think some people think of like, you overcome dyslexia, like Sally Shaywitz's book. It seems to imply that I'm no longer dyslexic once I can read words, right? The underlying mechanisms are still, your thalamus didn't heal, right? The ectopias didn't migrate to the correct location, okay? The same genetic influences are involved in reading performance at both times. So 10 years old, 16 years old, right? And to me, that's a clarifying statement there about that, you know, if you're dyslexic, you're dyslexic. That is not something that goes away, okay? You might be able to learn to become proficient in reading and spelling, okay? But you're still dyslexic, all right? From the twin study, deficits in orthographic coding, that's Ricky and I nicknamed us the orthography brothers, you know, because we really feel that's important. Deficits in orthographic coding have shown the most significant genetic influence. I've never seen that until real recently, all right? That is a new statement. And that's where I'm saying, you guys, you need to keep following the research. It's evolving as we speak, okay? This, you know, 2 years ago, this sentence was not in writing out there, and people were not being trained with this in mind. And so orthographic coding has the most significant genetic influence, okay? That's not just teaching you, that's, because I think there's a lot too, orthographic coding is real susceptible to poor teaching. Because the orthographic code of the spelling, right? And am I learning the patterns and the rules of spelling? That's teaching, okay? And so, but what it's saying is, you know, that there's also, it has a real strong genetic component to it also. And you got to kind of decide, is it dyslexia or is it dyslexia with this kid?
Good luck.
Well, I'm hoping that you're. So the relationship between phoneme awareness and phonological decoding is stronger than the relationship between phonemic awareness and orthographic coding. That makes sense. So phonemic awareness relates strongly to phonological decoding. See, that's when you're decoding sound by sound, you know, you're having to decode the word. That relationship is stronger than the relationship between phonemic awareness and orthographic coding. And I put a slide in here, you know, because the terminology, right, gets so overwhelming. Okay, what is orthographic coding? Okay, so the next slide, I got it, okay? The genetic influence is more pronounced in poor readers with higher intelligence scores than those with lower intelligence scores. And to me, that again is a real interesting thing. I think how I read that is that low intelligence does affect your reading. Okay, it's not causing the problem, right? Dyslexia is the problem, but it's an additional problem. Or, you know, it's an additional thing that's affecting your reading performance. All right. Whereas this, on the genetic influence, if you're like Ricky was saying, you get a kid who's got 125 IQ, okay, they can work around it, right? They've got strategies and right, and they've got ways to work around it, and so for them, the genetic part is the most significant part. Okay, their intelligence is a protective factor. But if you have low intelligence, it's an additional risk factor that goes along with your dyslexia.
How would poor orthographic coding show up on the assessment?
And it's coming in here too.
And that's what's so exciting, and Grant and I are finding, you know, there's ways to do it now.
Yeah. And you know, and I can't really say much. I'm very limited on what I can say, but I was drawn into last week a situation. It wasn't my evaluation. It was someone else's evaluation. The kid's at a middle school now, around a student with quote orthographic dyslexia. Okay, was the diagnosis. They came with a community-based evaluation. And so I had to, you know, they asked me to help with that, and so I dug into that orthographic, you know, just orthographic dyslexia, which would be the orthographic coding stuff, and there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of sort of equivocal stuff, but you know, I often turn to Mark Sadenberg, okay, University of Wisconsin, because his research, you read that one paper, you know, that the intervention one with the word building activity. He's got a lot of great research, and he even says, he qualifies that orthographic. He says, there's a strong environmental effect in orthographic stuff, meaning if did somebody teach you the code or not, right? If nobody ever taught you the code, then you're going to behave as if you have an orthographic coding problem, even though you might not.
That comes back to last week when I did my little thing about the there, and there spelling. How I'm starting to see there's orthographic processing, which is that the model word, what's it called, the PDP?
The CHC model or the,
No,
the PDP,
no, the
Parallel.
meaning,
Yeah.
the orthographic.
yeah,
Yeah, the parallel,
distributed
there we
processing.
go, I can never remember it. There's that level where you learn which letters go together, and that's like a processing thing. And then Mather calls it orthographic awareness, and I haven't quite figured out what she means by that. But what Brant's talking about is, I think, another level with there, and there. That's orthographic knowledge. You get taught that, and you have to pull it from your long-term memory. So it's not really a processing thing. It comes down to, did you get taught that, and were you able to retain it, and can you now pull it back out? Does that make sense? That's more of a knowledge level.
I think, yeah, man, so I think there's a strong classroom environmental component in orthographic problems. Where the phonology, I don't, there is that problem too, right? But I don't think it's as strong, So when I went into that research on it, here's what, from back when, in the 90s, what they were saying is, and I found multiple studies, and it said that 67% of the variants in phonological dyslexia, based on the phonological problem, are around 70% was explained genetically. Okay, that makes sense, right, with what we're saying? But then, back then, they were saying for orthographic dyslexia, it was only about 35% of the variance was genetic. And so that made me go, well, if only a third of it's genetic, 2/3 is environmental. Okay, and what is the environment? The classroom, right? Mostly, right? Especially around, did I learn the code, the alphabetic code and the rules of our language? But subsequent research out of Colorado from Olson, and that she cites in here, Olson 2007, because like I said, I got mired in a mess with this stuff this past week. I was back here in the references in the back of this book, and I had never seen that Olson 2007, and I still haven't seen it because it's in a book. There's a couple books that he published in. It's not available as PDFs, and so that was one of the ones that I wanted to get, and so, but
Can you see why, this is when Brant's district loves him. They have like a contentious or something going on like that. Who's gonna go find the answer?
Well, I think I did help. I think it was helpful to clarify it, for everybody, because I think everybody was kind of like, what is this? It's sort of like they got blinded with science in a sense, as it were, what is orthographic dyslexia,
So I know we probably didn't answer your question, Chris, because we
It's
can't
coming,
get.
so just bear with me, because it's gonna get more clear, okay? I know it's still fuzzy at this point, and there's a real, I understand there's a problem, there's so much terminology in here, and, okay? So Olson, this is from one of the things, I did find from again, this guy, he's at University of Denver up there, orthographic coding, so that's OC here, refers here to word-specific knowledge that cannot be derived solely from sublexical phonological decoding processes. Huh? Right? Sublexical, what's below the level of the whole word? The letters, or the sounds, right? And so I wish that they would be whenever I see that, I tell myself sublexical means letters and sounds, because it's at a level lower, the lexicon is the words, right? Okay? So orthographic coding refers to word-specific knowledge, so it's about each word, the letters and the word, that cannot be derived solely from sublexical phonological decoding, okay? And so it's separate from the phonological decoding. It cannot be derived solely from sublexical phonological decoding processes and subsequent associations with oral vocabulary. that's how in Sandberg's paper, he talked about in that impaired model, when they did the intervention, it could take a damaged phonological signal that was coming through, and it said it would pull it into to correct resolution, okay? And so you do that. If you're not processing the letters right, your brain is set up because of that parallel distributed processing. It can take with an intervention, it can take a degraded phonological process that was processed not correctly, but it can still pull it, it can still resolve it into the correct word, okay? And so, did you?
Well, actually, it just brought up, I don't know if it's one of the chapters we read in the Adams book, where she showed the letter that didn't form all the way, it could be an H or an A, but because of the letters on the sides of it, we automatically know which one is the correct, even though it's not a clear signal visually. Does that make sense? It's sort of like there's that parallel.
And I don't know if that was in that chapter that you guys did. So he also goes on word-specific orthographic knowledge, okay, the letters, was tested in this study by asking participants, here's an example of how they did that. I put this in because I thought I needed clarification, like what exactly do you mean by orthographic coding? Asking participants to find a word among two phonologically identical. So if you didn't see the word, somebody just said them, they're phonologically identical, okay? String, rain and rain, right? So the student has to choose which one of these is the proper one orthographically. Okay, so an orthographic choice task. Does WJ have that? No. Does KTEA have an orthographic? Nobody's
Not
got
like
it.
that.
Right, and so that to me, there you go. You see what I'm saying? Are we measuring the right things with our tests?
That's where I got,
Mathers?
Mather's got a book, or a test called Test of Orthographic Awareness.
The competence or,
Yeah, competence, and I'm pretty sure it has a lot of different tests.
yeah.
I think that one may be too. So I gotta get my hands on that.
What I'm having a hard time understanding is, okay, so we have people who have problems with homophones or something. Okay, what is, like, how does that affect you in your whole big life? I mean, like, I don't understand the.
Well, that's more of a, I think of, that one is more of a semantic level, right? That would be the semantic processor. It's like what Ricky had last week, right? Right, they're there and there, right? They sound the same, but they have different meanings. And
Yeah, but I mean, like, for example, so you mix up there and there your whole life. But it's not a big deal, really, in the grand scheme of things. But what else does it do? Like, what?
well, you have to attach meaning to the words, right? That's the end
Does
result.
it mean they have difficulty attaching meaning to all kinds of words, or?
Well, I can't answer that, yeah.
I mean, I don't know, so you spell
Well,
rain, R-A-N-E your whole life, okay, I mean, it's not that big of a deal
Yeah.
to me.
No, I agree that would be, if I was gonna choose my weakness, I would choose it there.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to understand if it's bigger than that, and I'm missing the.
Well, I was gonna say, when I'm teaching kids with reading, if they can't, like the rain and rain, like he has up there, if they can't figure out the sound that AI makes, well, and I guess you're right, it's not the sounds, but they can't figure out what the words are. They're not seeing the differences in the letter. You know what I mean? They're not memorizing the patterns. It goes back to
And
the
it's not connected
chunking
to the meaning.
and the syllables and the being able to
That's
pull
the
them apart.
instructional part, yeah.
And the kids would know the meaning of the spelling when they are used in context.
Right,
Because of the
right.
semantic.
Right, so that's, it sort of, it fits, I think, with that four-part processor model also pretty well. So I think there's more to come though, I think, on this. So, I threw this in. So, at Galaberta, he had these, the rat models, the mutant rats, right, where they had these, and they found that the phonological, auditory processing weaknesses resolved more in the female rats than the males. Okay, so what's different between a male and a female rat, right? The hormones, right? And so studies report a slightly greater number, and I think for a long time in the schools it's been the boys. There's more boys with dyslexia, right? I think that if you ask anybody on the street, they'd say, "Oh yeah, there's more boys with dyslexia." Studies, I think they're real equivocal on that. There's sort of a sampling bias because where they're getting, who they're studying, So studies report a slightly greater number of males than females with reading problems. This is from Mather, with an increased number of males in more severely impaired samples. So I'm still thinking there might be something to that, you know, to Galiberto's thing about the males versus the females. I'm not, for me, the vote, it's not, that is not clear yet.
I just want to come back to that, just this thing about the rain thing again. So we're talking about spelling on that level, but if that kid doesn't know the AI in reading, and he comes to RAIN, he may not get the rain. That's the flip side of it,
Right.
you know what I mean? So it's like you need that orthographic knowledge to be able to read, not just spell. So it's okay if you spell it, because everybody's gonna know when you put
Right. The
and
context.
E, that's rain, but if it's flipping over into the reading, it's gonna impact the person's reading.
Right, they'll say, they say ran.
So they're having difficulty associating meaning with all kinds of different words. Is that what I'm getting? Or I'm trying to
Well, I
understand.
think, and I think that gets into the comorbidity too with the kids with the language impairments, okay, that bleeds over more into the language end to me.
I'm just thinking, if they could read the word R-A-I-N as rain, they're not gonna have trouble with the meaning. It's their problem is on that word level, they're not able to read R-A-I-N and get the word rain.
They won't arrive phonologically at rain.
Right, like the one thing is that way later down the road, and they're stuck on this decoding. But how is that different from other dyslexics?
The orthographic ones. Well, because I think what they're saying is that there's kids who don't have phonological impairments, but they do have the orthographic weakness. Okay, they fall down on those orthographic choice tasks, even though they're fine phonologically.
Like if they
Is that-
spell rain, R-A-N-E, they know the silent E rule, and they're spelling, you'll see kids that have that, they'll do the spelling test and everything, I can tell exactly what they're trying to spell, but because they're doing it all phonetically, most of them are wrong.
So their phonology is intact, or you know, they can hear the sounds and they're putting down letters for the sound, but they don't need the conventions for the English language, right? And so you can phonologically decode what they wrote, and it'll sound like the word, basically, right?
So not all dyslexics are bad spellers, only orthographic ones are?
Well, no, and there's both. There's the combined type too,
Because I
right?
always thought that
I-
just like one side of dyslexia was sort of poor spelling.
I would say all dyslexics are bad spellers.
So then it would be hard to tell, well then, I'm just trying to figure it out, that's all, I'm just trying to.
One,
So if you have somebody with poor, dyslexic with poor spelling, how do you know it's an orthographic coding issue and not just?
a phonological. Well, you're testing their phonology, right? You've got scores, and you've got
This
other.
fifth grader I talked about a little while ago, his phonology is fine,
Yeah.
but he's having trouble with reading,
And I would say, and look back across the score history also too. And, you know, maybe back there in first grade, there's a paper trail of low phonological scores. I try to find those scores early too.
Sorry, just one more, so then the interventions are different?
Well, if a kid has, if the kid's phonological processing's fine, then he doesn't need a phonological intervention, right?
And is Wilson or Orton Gillingham phonological or orthographic?
Well, it's both,
well,
really.
they do the syllable types, which are really orthographic
Yeah.
conventions.
That's
So
what I think its strength is.
This is the other thing, is we're not gonna have the answers for you, because we're promising you, this is cutting edge right here, in my opinion. We don't have the answers
I mean,
yet.
I'm only just trying to process it, I
Well,
know it
and
may
I
sound
think
like I'm like trying to bring, I'm trying to
no.
understand it, like, because the intervention we provide is the same, whether it's orthographic coding or
Well,
whether
and it
it's
depends.
phonological.
You-
Maybe on a practical level. in a-
Right, if
yes,
you have a
not all
script,
options.
if you have a scripted curriculum that you're marching through, right, it's not gonna be individualized. However, you might have, you know, the great teacher who recognizes Johnny's phonology is fine, what he really needs to work on is the structure of the language, the written structure of the language, and the syllable types and that stuff.
And what was the book we talked about that's been sitting on my bedside table for 5 years?
Oh, speech to print, Louis Simone.
That is, you know, it is hard to read through, but that would answer, she says there are no irregular words. There's rules for every word, you just have to know which language it came from.
Right.
Because we have different influences in the English language. And that's part of where the orthography comes in, is knowing that's why teaching the structure of the language
Right.
might be more appropriate for
Well,
an orthographic dyslexia.
Yeah, and you know, in Mather, in just a second, Mather, she talks about the, in here, I don't know if you guys noticed that, in chapter 5, where she talks about, you know, there's, okay, so there's phonological deficits, there's orthographic deficits, there's processing speed deficits, there's working memory deficits, but she also talked about there's this morphological stuff and morphemic stuff. Nothing. Like there's nothing. At the end, she just kind of like let that one go. And I think that gets...
That comes back to,
right? And so
she talks about all that stuff.
I think the curricula are catching up, still trying to catch up with these problems, and the teacher training programs also, like, right?
So that's like, make friends with the speech therapist, because they can help us figure that part of language out.
I was excited, you know, when she said this morphemic stuff is really important. There's some sentence in there. She said it is really, really important. And then I was thinking, all right, well, it's going to be in here. There's going to be a couple pages on it, and then there was nothing. So hold on.
So, you're saying, what I thought I heard you say was that for dyslexia, it's not about not being taught correctly, it's not about something we've done.
That's right.
Okay.
It's not
But then
environmental.
For the coding,
The orthographic coding
Yeah.
stuff, right?
it's about not being taught
Well, there's
skills. So
it
then
matters.
does that make it not be part of
Well,
dyslexia?
so here's what if I can try to answer that. For a student who's not genetically at risk for dyslexia or is not dyslexic, they can have low quality instruction, right? That's, remember my 57% group, the 57% in New Mexico that always pass, okay? Even with low quality instruction and not the instruction that's not systematic, it's not explicit, okay? It's not sort of developmentally appropriate, you know, moving hierarchically through. They're gonna implicitly, they're gonna behave in rule-like ways as if they were taught those rules. Okay, when it's time to decode and spell, they're gonna decode and spell as if somebody had directly taught them the rules, even though they never were. Okay, but for the kids with the genetic risk factors, without the direct instruction, does that answer your question?
And even with the direct instruction,
because-
they continue to struggle.
Because, I mean, what I'm asking, I mean, to me, I guess I'm kind of lost.
Well, the curriculum and instruction really does matter, and somewhere in that chapter 2, she says that, you know, it really does matter, and it matters the most for the dyslexic kids. The other kids, right? They're gonna, you know, it's a continuum. It's not a dividing line.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so I think, you know, depending on where you are, you know, on that continuum, you need more or less systematic, explicit, direct instruction in the alphabetic principle and the code, okay? And if you're really severely impaired, even a great intervention that is real systematic and explicit and direct and, you know, goes from easy to more difficult, you know, does everything right, that's not even going to be sufficient, right? It's going to take even more of them. And so really that's how I see it, is depending on where you are in that continuum, whereas kids on this other end, basically you could lock them in the room with some books and they're going to come out reading and spelling great. And so, and there's a continuum between in there. And so if you're on this end, you really, really desperately need, the instruction is really going to affect your performance. Whereas if you're on this end, the instruction is really not going to have that much to do with it.
So where does the orthographic coding come in?
Well,
You said
it's,
you
if you're a kid, you know, where we talked about like the visual crowding and the visual aspect of, if we're talking about a quote orthographic dyslexic, things like in Mather talks about, and it's in here coming up, if you have those visual processing problems, the crowding, okay, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But also, for me, I think it's not just the crowding; it's that attentional processing stuff where the kids, they're skipping down, like, and they're down 3 words down the line, and they're not processing all the letters at the right time and at the right speed and in the right place. Okay, and so those kids, that they really need direct instruction and the code. They're not forming orthographic representations of those words.
Can I just, there's kind of I think it just fits here. This is a dilemma in this job. And we're talking about it with this, it's especially true for math for me, about the instruction versus is there a disability? Because I know there are a lot of elementary teachers that don't feel comfortable with math because they just aren't very good at math themselves, and I've seen that. And I've seen kids who, they don't need any instruction, they pick it up. But kids who might be borderline or in between, so we have to tease that out, and it's not easy to do, about is it instructional or is it internal?
And in there's a slide coming up, like what are the characteristics of an orthographic problem? That's really seems to be like maybe what's in the air here.
Well, and it seems like there's this other aspect of, is it a long-term memory retrieval problem?
Right, absolutely, exactly.
If they're not
Thank you.
remembering the AI rule with rain.
Right.
Yep.
That may not be indicative of dyslexia, right, but just like a general.
They have it
Yeah.
taught, but it's-
Right. Mather
Where
has.
it's there, they can't pull it out.
Yeah.
Mather has in one of, I think later on, a couple weeks down the line, we're reading in that Learning Disabilities book, a different book by Nancy Mather. In there, she has this sentence I really like. She talks about with a kid. He says, "I forgot to remember," right? And I think that's with these kids with the attentional problems and the executive skills. We're going to talk about the executive skills, the metacognitive stuff, where it's in there, but they're just the train's roaring down the tracks, right? And they're not using that what they got.
And we might be getting too locked into saying, are they orthographic dyslexics, or are they phonetic dyslexics?
Right.
I don't know that we can.
They're not discrete
If we look
groups.
at the processor, it's hard to pull, they just have dyslexia, and it's impacting those areas.
Most of them have characteristics of both, is what I would say. More commonly, it's not that common to see somebody who's purely phonological. You know, in Seidenberg, in some of those studies I read last week, they talk about that. It's pretty rare, in their end, they'd have 4 or 5 kids that were purely on this side or purely on that side, and there'd be 40 in the middle who were an overlap between the two. That's really what you're gonna see mostly. It's very rare that.
And I love what Chris brought up, it kind of fits with that, the CTOP is set up, you're looking for what processing areas are gonna influence the reading. And so we have phonological awareness, phonological memory, rapid naming. You may have a kid that does perfect on that, but then they bomb on that long-term retrieval stuff. And that may be why they're having that difficulty, is they just can't pull it back out.
I was just thinking about the kid the case you're working on that you can't say very much about, but, so it comes back with this very specific type of dyslexia that this child is diagnosed with. What do you do with that as a district?
Well, there's the question of, is it a proper diagnosis also, right? That's the, right? For me, what I say is look across their cognitive profile and look across their academic profile and see what their strengths and weaknesses are, If areas of weakness, even if they don't meet, a disability, they could still have tier 2 interventions, right? Make recommendations based on where their areas of need are, is what.
Did it seem legitimate to you, like the way they laid out their case and everything, or did it just seem like a weird, like, what?
I don't think I can say anything.
Usually it's the second, what you said, when you get something from out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let me keep going, because so coming up in here, that I'm darn sure I put a slide in, like the characteristics of orthographic problems in here, and I apologize, maybe I got them a little wacky on the order. 60% of children with reading disability also meet diagnostic criteria for another disorder, making it the rule rather than the exception. This is Nancy Mather, again, a clear statement, okay? I get these folders and they're like, I want you to look at this, like this one dot, but there's all these other dots over here. Don't worry about that, right? I believe that the way the field needs to grow is that if it's a reading referral, then you should be ruling out language and ADHD, okay? You've got to at least consider it, okay? Given that 60% of kids, right, they meet criteria for another disability. That says you've got to consider that stuff, okay, to do a good job, okay? And so I say if you suspect one, look for the others, okay? So if you've got reading problems, then you should be ruling out ADHD or a language impairment or this speech sound disorder, which I like the good old articulation problem. But it seems like, those guys in Colorado, is that the proper term?
Articulation.
Yeah, I think of, so I think, when you see this, or any one of these, then you should be ruling out the others, okay? Because in 60% of kids, if they have one of these, they have one of the others, okay? So it's more common than not, right? So non-word repetition, this was if non-word repetition is impaired in individuals with both a language and a reading impairment, but not in individuals with a language impairment alone. That is a really meaningful sentence, right? Because you're going to be, so you got a kid, right? You got a kid, you do the non-word repetition on the C-top. A bunch of you guys just did that, right? Okay, so if that's impaired and with a language and reading impairment, I say non-word repetition is impaired in individuals with both language and reading impairment, but it's not impaired in individuals with a language impairment alone. That's a diagnostic profile right there, right? It's not always the case, but in their studies, so the kids that have a language, and later on, I apologize, I can't tell you, one of our readings, the one from Frank Ramus that's coming up in either next week or the next week, where I got into this, and that's the first time I emailed Nancy Mather was, what's the difference between SLD in language and SLI, a language impairment? It seems like the same impairment, but just with a different name. I'm like, our laws and our regulations are completely unclear. And she emailed me back and she goes, yeah, you're right, it's totally muddy and it doesn't make any sense. So I finally found that paper, that Frank Ramus paper, he has this great graph, this chart on there. How do you separate? Is it dyslexia? Is it a language impairment? Is it both a dyslexia and a language impairment? Or is it neither? He has a 4-square, okay? And he has these characteristics, and that's kind of, he doesn't mention non-word repetition, but this would be something to help you decide, okay? Right? If they have a non-word repetition weakness, then you start to think about this stuff. So non-word repetition is particularly impaired in individuals with decoding problems, okay? So there's another, I think that's a real meaningful, that's a common thing. And so you're thinking about this when you're interpreting your non-word repetition scores from your C-top, okay? Thus, poor performance on non-word repetition tasks appears to be a marker for a language impairment that co-occurs with dyslexia. Right there, right? That's, you're going to have a sword fight with the IEP committee. Is it SLI? Is it SLD? Is it both? Okay, and here's some information that you can use to support whichever decision you come down on, right? And it's not just the score, it's the whole package that you think about, okay? I haven't seen clear language like this before, okay? It's always been very, very gray and muddy, okay? So, thus, this is from Mather again, thus a child with dyslexia and another child with SLI, that's a specific language impairment, may both have difficulty repeating a string of digits or orally presented nonsense words, okay? So either one, right? You could be right there, if you're having trouble on that part of the C-top, okay, then you might fall on either side of that line, or you might be one of those comorbid kids that has both. And that is definitely going to come up, okay? You're going to encounter that, okay? ADHD and dyslexia, 15 to 40% of children with dyslexia also are diagnosed with ADHD. Those are the ones who are diagnosed, right? That's not all of them. 25 to 40% of children with ADHD are also diagnosed with dyslexia. So you can see there's a real strong overlap there. And there is some overlap on the genetic stuff too, right? Where they've done that, okay? That to me says, when I see one, I need to be thinking about the other and ruling it out or confirming that on the other, okay? So early warning signs of the dyslexia, this is from her chapter, mild speech or articulation problems. So these are the younger kids, right? When you're, like those little guys, you're trying to decide, are they, are they at risk for dyslexia? Okay, mild speech or articulation problems. Okay, so they're having trouble, say, making the sounds of the language, trouble rhyming words, trouble recalling letter names. Okay, not interested in looking at print. I love that sentence. That one goes through the whole age, the whole lifespan. Okay, adult dyslexics generally don't read for pleasure. Okay, that's not right, and they're not interested in looking at print. God bless Nancy Mather. What a great statement that is. I was surprised that she didn't, after all that stuff from the beginning of the chapter, how a dyslexia evaluation begins with the family history, she left this one off. Family history of dyslexia, and that's my line there. If there's the family history of these things, then that's a big risk factor that's a warning sign that there's going to be a good chance of dyslexia. Okay, by the end of first grade, genetic influences may account for 65 to 80%, okay, of the variation in a child's response to instruction. That's right. That's a pure dyslexic. That's not dysteachia. That up to 80% of how they learn from the instruction is genetically based. Okay, that is a genetic disorder. Okay, but I think again, in my opinion, the orthographic, for those rare kids, now pretty rare kids who are more purely orthographic problems and where their phonology is okay. For those kids, it's only really with the Olson study from 2007 that I started to say, but I got off track. He's saying 50%. Okay, for those kids, for the orthographic kids, 50% of the variance in their response to instruction was genetic. So it's still real strong, okay, but it's not as high as the 65 to 80%. Okay. Yep.
Are these numbers just for students with dyslexia or for all students?
This is for the dyslexic kids.
Oh.
Yeah.
I think I just thought of, something, it kind of became clear for a moment, maybe. So if you give a student, let's say you think they have dyslexia, so then you give them the C-top and they kind of do okay on it.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go, okay, but this doesn't explain it. Then you go to maybe they have orthographic. So it's kind of like a process of
Mhm.
elimination in a way, like this
Yeah.
isn't explaining it enough, so I'm gonna go deeper
That's
into
right.
it.
That's right. You're interpreting further and further. And I would add to that, and I love that. Thanks for clarifying that. I would add again, I think it's real important to go backwards in time because this is our little snapshot, and that's just one snapshot. Okay, go backwards and see. There should be, and I don't, for our district we use NWEA, and NW has foundational skills, which includes phonology, and used to have an actual phonological score. And so I would pull up that kid's records, and I would look back in kinder and first, and now we have dibbles, right? And look, on dibbles, on the phoneme segmentation fluency, first sound fluency, whatever the phonological scores are, is there a history also? Because remember, for some people, the phonology, even though they were impaired early, it resolves with instruction and with time, okay? And so you want to also go backwards, right? Because it might be, okay, he's got a 91 on his C-top phonology, but if I go back to first grade, he was in the gutter. Okay, or it might be that he was okay back in first grade phonologically, so that informs it also. Let's see, there was another question, yeah?
So then, is the C-top that has to be given to students that we may suspect as having dyslexia?
Absolutely, yeah, I think it's the best thing.
There are other tools, and in other classes we'll talk about options, but yeah, that's the gold standard probably.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know why it's doing this. Okay, all right. So I think that you see how it's not just it's not just a 1 + 1 = 2. There's a lot of factors that to do a good job you need to think about this stuff, and that's where I'm hoping that you guys have a deeper sense of awareness of this, about like going back and there's some people with their phonological impairment, it resolves. But even so, they now score okay on C-top, that they're still dyslexic, and there's a sort of a halo effect where it's continuing to affect their decoding and spelling.
So then you would note that in the report.
Absolutely,
that,
yeah.
You looked back and you saw this dribble score, you would put all that information in.
Yeah, you want to support that whole triangulation thing. Like, if you're going to make a sort of a diagnostic judgment, you don't want to hang it on one score. You need to be able to support it with other scores or behaviors. What are the behaviors that are dependent on phonology, rhyming and writing? And so if they have classroom behavioral stuff that would support that also, it's not just scores.
Unfortunately, APS doesn't have that to look back at. So I'll tell parents in the meeting, I said, I would, say I'm testing a 4th or 5th grade, I'll say, my guess is that they probably were having difficulty with phonological awareness, but because of all the phonics instruction, they've been able to develop that. However, in APS, we include a dyslexia check sheet, right, from the parents to fill out. There are questions about rhyming and stuff on there, so you can dig in, and the parents saw it, you can say, well, it looks like there probably was a phonological.
So we don't keep their double scores and like.
Well, we weren't doing dibbles way back. I
Right.
mean, we were, and then we weren't. We changed so many times, you don't know. Plus, we don't have it archived in any way to find it at this point.
Right, the old Dibble scores, yeah. And when it changed to Dibbles Next, I think it, okay, here's, what your evaluation should include: an explanation of the reading difficulties. Is it phonologically based? Is it attentionally based? Is it visually based, right? That's what the parents want. That's what everybody wants. Is like, what is going on with this kid, okay? And then propose appropriate interventions, right, that are specific. That's kind of what you were saying. Well, what is the intervention? And so my recommendations are based, on the profile from what I saw with that kid. Not based on, like, go get this curriculum or that. They need phonological segmentation training, or they need phonological blending training, okay? That could come from different curricula. This one, this one, so, look, yeah, did anybody go to Catholic school, or you guys go to Catholic? Does this person look familiar? I told my neighbor who's dyslexic, he went to a Catholic school, and he's about 58 years old or something, and he said that, and he's severely dyslexic, his profiles, on the rapid naming, the phonology, all that stuff, he's the classic dyslexic. He said the nun would get a ruler and crack his knuckles when he couldn't read. Literally, they would beat him on the hand with a ruler, and so that's where I thought. So this is from Mather. This is what she says, though. I added the picture is my addition. An excellent classroom teacher and a supportive classroom environment are critical for children with dyslexia. Okay, because children with dyslexia often have low self-esteem related to the slowness of their reading and writing development. A teacher must be particularly sensitive, and so. That I thought of his experience at the Catholic school. Nothing against the Catholic schools. Okay, so she in here. I just wanted to clarify this. She mentioned these guys, Jack Fletcher and Reed Lyon and the Fuchs at Vanderbilt, Doug and Lynn Fuchs. She mentioned this study in here, and she said, you know what? They came to the conclusion really that the type of instruction doesn't really matter. I don't know if you remember that sentence in there, because that really it stuck in my head, And I read that book. I have that book, the 2007. That one I actually have the book, and that was not really. They kind of said that, but they also really qualified it. And so here's what they really said. Okay, effective programs are explicit and systematic. Okay. So I'm explicitly teaching the parts of the code, and I'm systematically moving through it. I'm not bouncing around all over the place, okay? Explicit instruction, systematically from easy to difficult, okay? They're oriented to academic content, so there's not a lot of crap in there, okay? They teach to mastery, so it's important, we're making sure before we move on, you've mastered this part before we go to the next more challenging part, okay? They provide scaffolding and emotional support. Okay, that's really important. If you've had so many failure experiences, we don't want that emotional bomb to blow, because once it blows, then it makes it 10 times harder to do the intervention, okay? And they include progress monitoring. So that's really what they said. They didn't just say any old program will work, because it almost seemed like she said that whichever the program didn't matter. In my opinion, the program really matters. And what you want is a program that meets these criteria here. That's the kind of program that's going to work. And there's more, it really needs to, they go on to say it focuses on the structure of the language. What these guys, it was this book where they said that they did a meta-analysis of do multisensory techniques add value to these programs. And they came up with not really, there's no harm in them, but they didn't come to the conclusion that it works. But I do believe that there are a lot of kids that the multisensory stuff does help. Not every kid. For some kids, it's just some extra stuff. But if you're that kid that it will benefit, then it really works really great for those kids, doing that tactile stuff. And you can imagine, if my phonological processor's gummed up if I have some other way to sort of activate that information and that sound, then that helps, okay? All right, so, all right, this is chapter 5. We finally made it to chapter 5, okay? A skilled reader not only has cognitive and linguistic abilities intact, okay, so we've talked about that, right? But is able to integrate the various processes fluently. The reason I pulled this sentence out, they might be able, they can, if we don't do a timed measure of phonology or memory or decoding, they can do it. They can hack their way through and get it done. And that's why Dibble's, I don't know if all of Dibble's, but I think all Dibble's measures are timed. They're all fluency measures. It's not just can you do it, but can you do it at the right speed such that the cells that fire together wire together, right? You've got to be able to integrate this stuff, and you've got to be able to do it fluently. I think that's a real important part, okay? So training in phonological awareness is necessary, but insufficient for good reading. That's kind of what Ricky's saying, that, you got to do the phonology, but there's all this other stuff too. You've got to learn about comprehension, and you've got to learn all this stuff, right? Adequate word reading requires complex phonics skills and automaticity with sight words. There's Marilyn Adams, right? And that stuff we talked about in the past about that. You gotta, comprehension is completely dependent on automaticity with sight words, okay? Fluent reading and accurate spelling involve phonemic awareness, okay? So you guys got your CTOP where you're measuring that. RAN, the CTOP is the rapid automatic naming. The CTOP's measuring that. Processing speed, that's on the WISC, okay? Orthographic coding, that's where Ricky and I are saying that most of the tests don't have that, especially like those orthographic choice tasks. If you get a specialized assessment like Ricky has, that test of orthographic competence, it's designed for that. But the big boys out there, they really are kind of behind the curve on measuring orthography. The KTEA, which is an academic achievement test, does, and I got it coming up here in a second, does generate an orthographic composite score. Okay, so if you do KTEA, you can, and what I did with, remember I was talking about the thing that happened with me this week with the schools? That student was tested before KTEA 3 was published. And so, but they did have a RAN score, they did have a word reading fluency score from the test of silent word reading fluency, and they had a spelling score. Those are the three things that you combine to get that orthographic composite. And so you can make an orthographic composite out of spelling, a word reading fluency score. There's a time, right, issue, and then the rapid automatic naming. Those three go together to make an orthographic composite score. I'm sorry if that I know your head is swimming, but it is. That's the difference, right? Poor oral language by itself, that's a language impairment. That's not dyslexia. Okay, they often co-occur, right? We had those slides about the comorbidity, but those are two separate issues, the two separate deficits going on there. And then, so I said, however, many individuals with dyslexia do have comorbid language disorders, right? We saw the statistics. What was it, around 40% or something that with the comorbidity? Okay, so here's what I wanted to say. So you get your low CTOP score, right? And you can't just hang your hat on that. That's not enough to say this kid has a dyslexia and is phonologically impaired. We need to be able to support that, so it's not just one score at one time. So articulation errors commonly, go together with this stuff. Mispronunciation of multisyllabic words, that's the tongue-tied sort of thing, trouble remembering sound symbol relationships, so now we're getting into the code, the code-based stuff. Over-reliance on whole word and context cues when reading. Okay, you see how these are the kinds of things you can use this to support your CTOP score in there. Yeah, I got the score, but then it has environmental, validity based on these factors also. Trouble pronouncing and spelling phonically regular nonsense words. Okay, slow reading rate, difficulty sequencing sounds when reading. Difficulty applying phonics to pronounce unfamiliar words. These are all characteristics that you could use to support a CTOP score. Because that kid's going to be sitting on the fence, and you're going, okay, well, what is it? What's going on? I need some more evidence, and you can think about these things, okay?
And again, APS built a little form that the teacher fills out and the parent fills out, and they ask a lot of these questions. So if you're writing a report in APS, you've got a document that you can use to support that CTOP score.
In I think in the Mather chapter that's coming up in that other book in a week or two, she has these questionnaires also, or
Yeah.
she has orthographic processing questionnaires, and I Xerox that and I send it home to the families and get them to,
Yep.
and or the teachers and get them to fill it out, to get more information. Okay, so how is rapid automatic naming related to reading? Okay, this is, I didn't have time. I've got a PDF of a paper. The title summed it up for me. It said, RAND, easy to measure, difficult to do intervention on. And that's really my sense of it, is that it's really easy. You do that rapid naming task, it takes a couple minutes, right? And you can get a standard score about that. But what do you do with RAND deficits is still the Wild West, is pretty much, I've never seen any. So she talks about that in here about, like she had the caution thing. RAND and reading involved, and then this comes straight from Marianne Wolf. This is, if we have a second, and I hope we do, I'll show you this sentence is exactly in my report, okay? RAND and reading involve multiple perceptual, so that's auditory, visual perception stuff, lexical, that's the words, right, and motoric processes. So when a RAND, what I say at the IEP, the rapid naming task, it's not reading, but you're drawing on those same subsets of skills that you use when you are reading. Okay, you're having to do the perceptual stuff. You're having to access your lexicon, the words and the sounds. Okay, you have the motoric. You have to say the word. Okay, and so even though that RAND is not reading, you use those same sets of processes in both activities. And so,
And I worked it out for myself, not looking up. What I tell parents is I say, especially for the rapid naming of letters, if you think that there's a fraction of a second before a kid, smaller than that, it doesn't have very much, to recognize the letter first, and then you gotta figure out the sound that goes with it, and you have that delay for each letter. By the time you get to the end of the word, your memory's not gonna be able to hold all that. And that's how I see the rapid naming.
and you remember the experiment from Marilyn Adams where they had the 1/200th of a second delay, the dark screen came on, and that was enough to shut down the process. So you think about that, that's, down in the hundredths of a second of delay is enough to really gum up the process. So if that kid is delayed in visually recognizing it or getting the sound, that's enough to significantly affect their ability to correctly recognize the word and automatically. That's the issue. Both RAND task and reading task require integrating visual and verbal information with an element of speed. That speed thing, that integration is really important, okay? The smooth integration of visual, and then I put in the orthographic symbols, and verbal, the phonological labels and sounds, and attentional, the conscious effort systems, is essential for reading. So all those things have to integrate smoothly. They have to be working properly and synchronously, okay, at the right time. All right, so Marianne Wolf, this is the double deficit. Phonological, there's the one type of deficit, you just have the phonological part, okay? The second one is you just have the naming speed, and then the double is you have an impairment in both. That's what the CTOP's getting at. So I really liked that Nancy Mather put in, she had a little box in there, it said caution, right? Knowledge, this is from her, knowledge of the exact processes involved in RAND tasks is not only limited, but it's also contradictory. That's my experience. It's not, this has not been clearly resolved.
And I think part of it, I have this problem with those of you, we looked at the CTOP last time we met. I can see the relation between rapidly naming letters and rapidly naming numbers, and I see them often correlate with difficulties in math, difficulties in reading. Where I have the problem is when they're rapidly naming colors and objects. I can't see, on a broad view, I see how it could impact, but I don't see how it impacts specifically basic reading.
I agree.
So I think, I don't know how they're measuring, so
Yeah.
how are they using which type of rapid naming? Is it the devil's in the details?
Right, exactly. Thank you. Researchers do not agree about the underlying processes involved in naming speed deficits. That was my experience when I started. I had a family where the kid was a naming speed only kid, right? But they're not very common, right? But it was that type. And the mom was a really smart dentist and really successful, and the kid was also gifted, right? But also had the emotional problem, it was a complicated thing. So the mom's like, well, I want you to help me. What about this RAND thing, So I started trying, I went deeper and deeper into it, and I never got to the other end of the tunnel, right? I just ended up at the bottom, and I was like, I can't.
We'll all be in that tunnel at some point too.
All right, so she talks about processing speed also, that matters for, in the integration of stuff, and I think of processing speed around that 1/200th of a second, right? If my ability to resolve the letter name or the letter sound or the sight word, if it's even gummed up a little bit, then that's interfering with that interletter activation and the cells that fire together, wire together stuff, okay? And processing speed affects working memory. And we haven't really gotten to working memory yet. We're going to have a separate class on working memory. So in the face of, I chopped these sentences out, okay? Remember I said they always say these limited cognitive resources? I hate that. What do you mean limited? What resources? What? What is the limited cognitive resource? For me, it's attention. Anything that requires conscious attention, that's the bottleneck. That is the limited cognitive resource. If it requires attention, that's the limit, okay? Subconscious processes, that's why they're parallel, right? They're going on all at once, simultaneously, okay? They don't require conscious attention. There can be tons of subconscious processing parallel at one time going on, okay? But if it requires conscious attention, it gets really restricted. So I chop this out. In the face of limited processing resources, attention, the speed of processing is critical because it determines how rapidly limited resources, attention, okay, can be reallocated to other cognitive tasks. And so that was what happened to me. After a while, what is the limited cognitive resource? Because you see that if the reader's cognitive resources are focused on decoding, the focused attention, right? Decoding a word, there will be limited cognitive resources, attention, available for comprehension. And so for me, whenever I see that, I always just drop in the word attention or attentional resources, okay? So that's the deal, right? If your attention, your limited attention, which we all have, is focused on decoding and having to figure out that word and it's not automatically recognized, then you don't have any attention left over for comprehension, or you have a lot less left over, okay? So here was I tried to find a graphic. Which limited cognitive resources do you mean, Dr. Big Brain? And because you're going to see that, I'm hoping that I haven't scared you away from pursuing educational research stuff. You see that term over and over again. Okay, so the white matter, the brain, there's the gray matter, which is the cortex, right, or the cerebral cortex, and then I apologize for my slaughtering this, but underneath that is all the white matter, the connectivity, the stuff that's connecting the different areas of the brain, okay? So the brain's white matter in the temporal parietal area, so that's the junction between the temporal and the parietal areas, that juncture there, is organized differently in good and poor readers. So here's some more sort of biological and structural evidence that supports that it's a real disorder, right? Okay. I think of white matter, as learning dependent and behavioral. It's the more you do something, the more strongly those things get wired together. It's like, and so I think there is a genetic predisposition to have poorer white matter, but I think that also that poorer white matter is because their experience was bad. That they're learning one or the other, the phonological processor or the visual processor is gummed up, and so these things are not being connected. They're not connecting. They're not firing simultaneously enough, and they're not being wired together. And because of that, they're not firing together enough. Then that white matter doesn't develop like it would.
It comes back to Sherry's comment about the kids she works with from the lower socioeconomics. I think that's where those connections don't get made because they don't have the exposure.
Right. This area of the brain, so this temporal parietal area, is thought to be where visual and auditory information is integrated. That's reading, right? The visual and the auditory is integrated. And so if you've got some weakness in that area, if that area is not wired up real strongly, that's going to affect your reading, okay? And then it's sent forward for further processing. So processing speed underlies performance in many areas and is not specific to one area or disability. I think of processing speed, that's the devil's in the detail again. Is my rapid naming weakness because I have a global processing speed weakness and all speeded tasks I'm slow on, or is it specific to verbal visual tasks, right? There's different, and so that's where you guys will have to think about that. Look, well, did they have a block design? There's a fluency, there's a time thing, and look across all their fluency scores and see, is there a global fluency thing that would seem to say, okay, there's a global processing speed, or is it more that I'm just down here in RAND, but on other measures of fluency I'm fine? Because you'll see it both ways, okay? And so processing speed is not specific to one disability. It's sometimes referred to as a domain generals, meaning that it's broader deficit rather than a specific to just one type of disability. All right, so orthographic coding, I don't know how I put it back here. Printed word recognition involves two major components, okay? Phonological coding, so this is using letter-sound correspondences. That's decoding, right? Phonological decoding. All right, and orthographic coding using letter and word patterns to aid in the pronunciation. So my knowledge that AI says A helps me to pronounce that instead of saying RAN for R-A-I-N or RIN, right? My knowledge of the orthography of the spelling aids in the pronunciation, okay? And that's where, again, I think there is a big instructional component in there, all right? Phonology enables the initial formation of lexical representation, so that's the words, the pronunciation of the word, but orthography provides the more detailed representations that are the gateway to highly skilled reading. I pulled this out. That to me, that's the interletter activation, okay? And how I've said that you gotta become automatic with your sight words if you're going to be a fluent reader, and the way you become an automatic sight word person is through interletter activation. Well, interletter activation is orthography, right? And so even though I sent Nancy Mather an email once and I said, why don't you talk about the 4-part processor in PDP? And I think I'd mentioned this before, and she said, well, it just seems so mechanistic to me. And this to me is a PDP sentence right here. This is, she's saying what they're saying, what Marilyn Adams said in chapter 6 in that orthographic chapter, that the gateway to highly skilled reading is through the orthography, okay? So I pulled that out. Orthographic awareness, this is Mather's term, I love that, Ricky pointed that out, that instead there's phonemic awareness and there's orthographic awareness, and so this is what she said, orthographic awareness, and I might have taken this from a different book from her, is awareness of how print works and how it looks, okay? So how the rules and how we spell our language. Orthographic awareness is awareness of how print works and how it looks, the visual representation of the language, okay? The letters and letter patterns that are used to represent words in print. And that, to me, the letters and letter patterns, that sounds like instruction to me, for kids who are not reading disabled, they don't really need that real systematic and explicit instruction because they're going to, infer those rules and they'll behave in rule-like ways. But for those dyslexic kids, they need direct, systematic, explicit instruction on the letters and letter patterns that we use to represent the English language. Okay, all right, so recognizing a printed word occurs at several different levels, okay? Recognition of the individual letters, so this is kind of like Marilyn Adams also, okay? Recognition of letter patterns, so we're starting to see syllables and to group things together and automatically recognize chunks of words. And then here she dropped in the morphemes, which are the units of meaning in the word. And she keeps kind of dropping it in there, but then she really punted on that. And then including root words with the morphemes. that's, to me, there's the Nancy Mather, Virginia Behringer, different people really are starting to, Louisa Moats in the letters training, they're really starting to realize and emphasize that morphemic awareness stuff, that where the kids have awareness of the root words and the meaningful parts of words, not the spelling codes and not the pronunciation, but this is the part that gives it meaning. And I had, if you'll pardon me, I had a morphological or a morphemic moment when I was reading this. I remember when I was doing a training once, there was some, they you know how they'll give you like a medical text, a Xerox from a medical text, and they'll go, all right, everybody read this, what's this mean? They like to you know, write it as part of like a teacher training thing. And I was at this training with my wife, and you know, she was at the medical school, so she knows all it, and she's super smarter than me. And so, you know, there were key words in there that because I didn't know those words, and nobody in the room except for my wife knew the meaning of those words, you couldn't extract the meaning out of the, you know, and it was to demonstrate that, you know, you've got to be able to know these words to take meaning out of it. Well, one of the words, it was a peri something. It was like a peri something effect, right? Well, I didn't know that peri means P-E-R-I, okay, that whatever that is, a root word or a prefix, means around, okay? And so then I was reading in here, and she used the word periphery, right? Oh, it was about the visual crowding, and we'll see it in there where she used that word, how the letters in the periphery are crowding in. And I thought, well, there it is, the peri, right? Around. They're the letters that are around what you're focusing on. And so I very much believe that morphemic stuff is real helpful.
It seems like understanding morphemes and root words, though, is a developmentally appropriate thing as a child ages.
Absolutely. It's further up in the curriculum, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
When I'm doing some teacher training to help teachers kind of understand, morphemes go even beyond the roots.
Yeah.
You think of like the word bat
Yeah,
and bats.
right.
You can have bats with just a plural S, or you can have bats with an apostrophe S.
Right.
Or you can have bats with the apostrophe on the outside,
Mhm.
and they all mean very different things,
Mhm.
and kids have to be taught pretty
Yeah.
explicitly those
Mhm.
subtle differences, and not just to even ignore
Right, right,
just
right.
those little pieces.
Well,
And the bats with the apostrophe on the outside, that's 3 morphemic pieces.
Yeah.
It's the root, it's the plural, it's 4.
and possessive,
And possession of the root.
And it's all orthographic, it's
Mhm.
visual,
Right.
it's not auditory.
right, right, yeah. So if you get the letters training, I haven't had I've gotten, you know, well, I purchased some of the manuals and read it, but she has a unit on the morphemic stuff in there. And so I think that the trainings and maybe the curricula are starting to include that in there, but only just now. If a reader is only able to recognize individual letters, word reading will be slow and inefficient. So this is from Nancy Mather, but isn't that exactly what Marilyn Adams said, right? That the interletter stuff, if you're just going letter by letter and you're not doing interletter activation and activating multi-letter units, then they're not going to be sight words, and if they're not sight words, it's going to be slow and inefficient. Okay? All right. Readers with dyslexia do not demonstrate greater difficulty than, this is that periphery, I think, greater difficulty than readers without dyslexia in recognizing letters presented in isolation. So if we give them one letter at a time, the dyslexic kids and the non-dyslexic kids, they can perceive them at the same rate and accuracy, okay? They, meaning the dyslexics, do demonstrate greater difficulty discriminating letters when they are presented in groups. Okay, this is based on some studies. The presence of other visual stimuli, that would be the other letters, appears to impair the ability to focus on the target stimulus. And so that's that, you know, SNPs at Harvard, you know, the visual crowding stuff going on. I have not seen this again until this book, and you know, SNPs in this book is the only place I've really seen this. You know, there's a little bit, you know, I'm out there in France and in Italy, they're doing more research on this, and then over there they go, yeah, the visual stuff really is happening, but in America there's still sort of this denial about that. So what I say to you is, you know, you're going to be watching for that. Is that what's going on with this kid? Okay. Again, we don't have a proper assessment for that, but you're watching for, you know, maybe behavioral signs. When I do rapid naming with the kid, when I see him going down the line, and they're naming a letter that's over here, then they come back and they're doing this kind of stuff, you know, a little thing going off in my head that this is one of those kids who's got that problem with the visual attention, okay? So when a word is presented in a sentence, the additional visual stimuli to the left and right, so that's the visual, the other letters and words, okay, in the periphery, interfere with the perception of that word. Okay, so we talked about that with Schnepp's. The features, and I put in letters of the nearby words. And this is where I think the field needs better control of the language. Features, why don't you just call them letters? Why did you call them features, right? I don't know, maybe the apostrophes and stuff, they want to include that, and that's why they didn't just limit it to letters, but the features of the nearby words get mixed up with the target words features, okay? So there's mostly the letters there. Okay, I guess, is that a repeat on that one? Oh no, research indicates individuals with dyslexia demonstrate more difficulty in suppressing peripheral vision while reading than do non-impaired readers. This is that stuff from those, if you look in the book, the references are in the back, those Italian people, the French and the Italian, you'll see all the references are coming out of there. Dyslexics are slowed because of greater visual crowding effects that limit the rapid perception of letter strings, and as a result, cause the reader to make numerous fixations. Okay, that's the effect, that's what's interfering. So then I say this, you know, Hebb's rule, cells that fire together, wire together, okay? If I'm jumping around, you know, and I'm looking at these letters and other letters are coming in, things are wiring together that shouldn't be wiring together, right? I need the letters that in the right sequence in this word to wire together in that sequence, not this letter bleeding in from over here. All right, and you know, Schnepp's on his study, he had, remember, 30% of this in their study, and I think it was a very high quality study, 30% of the kids, the dyslexic kids, had that visual crowding effect going on, okay? And so that says to me that it's not uncommon, and that hopefully you guys will look for that, okay? Although orthographic processing is a visual task, the visual processing task on many current cognitive tests, so on the WISC, it's the block design and picture completion, which is one of the supplemental ones. Picture completion, it's like they look at the bell, but the little ringer is missing, and the kid has to say, oh, what part's missing? And they tell you the part that's missing. That's a visual processing task, but it has nothing to do with orthography, right? And so there's this disconnect between the visual processing that's measured in most cognitive batteries versus the orthographic visual processing, okay? So they're saying that there's that, you know, they're not the same thing, okay? Block design, picture completion, while visual do not measure orthographic processing. Rapid object naming does not measure orthography, okay? When it's a pencil or a boat or a chair, okay? Even though they're visual tasks. So this was, I remember saying that you can make your own orthographic composite score. On the KTEA, which you guys will eventually use, I don't know right? So they combine, there's 3 subtests in there that they combine. The rapid naming, it's rapid letter naming, in fact, is what it is on there, okay? It's not any old naming, it's rapid letter naming, combined with spelling, combined with word identification fluency, and you see that fluency, so it's a speeded, it's a time word identification. Those 3 go together to make an orthographic composite score. So if you thought, and I believe that I don't know what research Alan Kaufman and Nadine Kaufman used to support the bringing these together as an orthographic composite, but I have a lot of faith in Alan Kaufman. He's a brilliant, cognitive scientist, and so I can't tell you what this rests on, but I think Alan Kaufman is really talented.
And I've been using this since the beginning of this year when KT came out. I've been doing this orthographic composite on almost every kid I test. It makes me a little nervous that I'm using this is my processing score that's then going to predict that they're going to have trouble with spelling and word reading.
Because these are academic
scores. I'm using the scores for you see what I'm getting? It's like.
Well, to me, that's the nature of that orthograph, just like you're saying, that what is it? Is it instructional, or is it cognitive, or is it genetic, right? It's sort of right there at the crossroads of all that stuff. And so, I think what Ricky's saying is, I'm using an academic score to create a processing score, and that processing score is proving that I have a weakness in my academic score, right? So there's a bit of
is that about? Yeah.
Right? And so but I think that they're onto something here, but you can see where maybe this is still sort of in its infancy, you know, and or maybe I've never seen Nancy Mather's standalone orthographic test. You know, maybe it's better for that. All right, so that's.
What's the difference between RAM and word identification fluency?
Word identification is a good question, thank you. They're decoding a list of words, but it's timed. Okay, and so they're real words and they're having to read them out loud to you, okay? And so like I was saying, that kid, that case that came up with me, KTA hadn't been published yet, but what they did is they did the test of silent word reading fluency. Okay, so they're not reading them out loud, but it is a word reading fluency test, okay? So they had a word reading fluency score, they had a spelling score, and they had a rapid naming score from their CTOP. Okay, so I was able to put together an orthographic composite. Okay.
So RAM would be maybe like looking at colors and naming them, or?
Well, specifically on this, you want to use letters, rapid letter naming, because it's the orthography, right? Okay. So I threw this in, you know, like I called, right? Nancy Mather is the other great lady. You remember that Dr. Hugo Kerr called Marilyn Adams the great lady, and so this was my email. I just cut and pasted. I apologize, it's a big long wall of text. I emailed her. So this was my email to her. And so I said, our district has not received the new WJ4 test kits yet. So I've been watching the SlideShare PowerPoints. If you go onto the slideshare.org or I don't know, I think it's .org, and search Nancy Mather or Kevin McGrew, there's some slide, you know, you can see their PowerPoints. So I've been watching the PowerPoints from you and Kevin McGrew. I was somewhat surprised that letter pattern matching, okay, so this is where it's like an orthographic choice test, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's people in this room that know it better than you do.
Yeah, I've never administered it. I still have never done this.
Those of you that are in the second class that are doing the cognitive, and we did it in class, this is the one where you, for 3 minutes, they mark the 2 letters, and then it goes strings of letters, and I don't see it as an orthographic processing. When I got it, I didn't think that's what it was, and it's not matching up with it on the things that I do.
Well, so I
want to see what.
I've never actually seen it. I still haven't got my hands on this test yet. So I thought it was because somewhere in the SlideShare they talk about it being a measure of orthography. I think that's why I sent this email out, right? Because I thought, all right, there's an orthography, yeah, right. It's going to be great. It's going to help me to untangle the orthographic mess, right? But remember our CHC factors, and they did this factor analysis, right? And the letter pattern matching, it loaded on perceptual speed. It was a processing speed, right? And so that surprised me, right? Since it's time, this is my question, there's some logic there, but as a measure of orthographic processing, I was expecting it to have some sort of spelling, you know, the G, the reading and writing, right? And spelling is one of the narrow abilities under the GRW. So that's what I thought. I thought, well, I would think that since it's letter pattern matching, you know, that it's going to load onto spelling, right, or some sort of reading and writing thing. So, but it didn't. According to the factor analysis, it was all speed. It was the speed was the factor that it was measuring. Okay. So here's her response. So she said the main thing is perceptual speed. Most people would have equal advantage on this test because they read well. And here's that split, right? There's 2 groups of people in the world, in a sense, right? Or in your world, typical readers and impaired readers. And it's a continuum. It's not 2 discrete groups, right? But most people would have an equal advantage in this test because they can read well, which means they can automatically recognize the letters. They don't have an orthographic weakness or some sort of weakness or a visual attentional weakness. Because they're fluent readers, they've wired that stuff together, okay? They have an equal advantage on this test because they read well. So it seems like with only a small sample of people, students with reading disabilities, that's where she says the small sample, but it's not that small, right? It would be measuring an aspect of reading skill. And so I threw this in because, you know, there's those correlational studies. Remember back a few weeks back when that chapter about, you know, well, so I got a kid who's got a weakness, and does he have a processing, a CHC factor that correlates with that's low, right? That's how we're going to determine if they have a disability. Well, one group, it correlates on this side, and on another group, it correlates on that side. Do you see what I'm saying here? That's where the devil's in the details. if you just look at the factor analysis from the WISC forward, what it says is letter pattern matching, and I might be off because I've never even seen it, is a processing speed measure. But what she's saying in her message is, if you've got a reading disability, it's gonna load differently.
I don't agree. And
When-
I have
yeah.
an example on a kid that I just tested, and I did this with her first grader. Did rapid letter naming with her, and she called a C a K every time. So I couldn't even score it because she had too many errors on the C-top that you guys have done. But even if I did the time, she would be really low, and she's definitely got a reading disability. She got like 100, because it's a visual matching
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
You don't have to know the names of the letters. You don't, all you have to see is what two look alike.
Yeah, it could be anything, a
Just
star
like
and
the
a moon.
numbers, when you're matching the numbers, they even call it. They
Yeah,
don't say that about the
Okay.
numbers, although she mentions that there.
because there's a separate number matching task, right, or
Because
subtask?
it's a visual,
Yeah.
just,
Well-
do they match visually?
Well, then your experience would bear out the factor analysis, right? That it is more about the speed and stuff, right? So, all right, so let me keep going here. So she says, so she goes on, the number pattern matching is what you're talking about, is the other
Yeah.
one, right? That, anyway, I think the letter pattern matching will be a measure for helping to document reading disabilities. But again, this is before the test was out, and so it might be that, right? That as time goes on, that it declares itself one way or the other, right? Okay, so I put this in what I call the two towers. What develops along with phonology is orthography, and in skilled reading, orthographic representations take on an increased role. That's interletter activation leading to sight words, okay? Right? In skilled reading, orthographic representations have an increased role. I completely agree, and we need to be aware of that. And then I put that this is due to that interletter activation. So then I just wanted to throw, have I done signal noise?
Yeah. you
Have
do.
we already done signal noise? I just wanted to make sure, because we're moving on from dyslexia after this. Tonight, the dyslexia doors are, gonna close a lot. Because we're moving on to to working memory and to executive skills and to report writing, and so I just wanted to let you know that let me just get this one sentence. This is from Seidenberg, from this, this stuff. People with dyslexia may have a harder time distinguishing a signal from the noise, not because they can't perceive the signal as been thought. There used to be these theories, that the magnocellular theory and all this stuff, but because they're not adept at filtering out the background noise, okay? So there are all the noise environment, and that's both visual and auditory. And so he says, in fact, the deficit we found is not specifically visual. We think of it as a sign of a basic problem in sensory perception, okay? They have the same signal noise problems, some dyslexics, with visual or with auditory, okay?
I'd be interested to know if the study separated out dyslexics that had ADHD and dyslexics that did
Right,
not have
exactly, and see,
ADHD.
that's where the,
Devil's in the detail.
right.
Because my
Yeah.
ADHD family has a hard time with that, but I always thought it was their ADHD, not their.
Right, well, I think, yeah, and exactly, I agree with the comorbidity. Okay,